Okay, so we're continuing with period 8, and we're going to be wrapping up the Vietnam War today, and we're going to get into a little bit of the anti-war movement and how the United States, like citizens, responded to our involvement in the conflict in Vietnam. So if you remember, we were already involved in what was going on between North Vietnam and South Vietnam all the way back in the 1950s, but that just continued to escalate through the decades. And when Johnson was president in 1964, we officially started sending troops in, sort of in a, well, we started sending more troops in as an advisory capacity, but we, really that's the first time that we started sending a lot of troops for the purpose of combat, and that's when we consider ourselves to really be involved officially, in the war full on. Now, we know that in 1968, the war took a turn for the worse after the Tet Offensive. And since that, regardless of major bombing campaigns, things like Operation Rolling Thunder, all of that stuff, like aside from that, we were still constantly trying to play catch up, and we were never really able to get a good footing in the war. So when people were responding to the war, they hated it. There was a huge anti-war sentiment. Most Americans did not believe that we should be involved in the Vietnam War anymore. That doesn't mean that most people were protesting, but that silent majority of middle America, they definitely didn't support us being in the war. And so when you think about it, we had spent close to $150 billion on the war. Many Americans, we're going to lose, some around 80,000-ish American soldiers during this war. High rates of PTSD and other traumas from the experience of combat for the ones that make it out. Not to mention we have to draft during this war, which a lot of people were against. And we're really unable to see like a unification in America during this war. If anything, this caused us to be more divisive. And so, of course, LBJ decided not to seek re-election in 1968, and that made it difficult for the Democrats to really get any type of footing during that campaign season, and it made it pretty easy for Nixon to win election that year. And remember, when he ran for president, he ran saying, I'm going to get us out of the war. And truthfully, at the beginning of 1969, when he took office, he was saying that we're going to, start negotiations with North Vietnam. We're going to start plans for peace. 1 month after those negotiations began in February, the Viet Cong launched a brutal and violent attack on our forces, and we started receiving heavy losses. So even while we were trying to negotiate with them, we were still seeing like really high casualty rates. So Nixon and his intel got some information that there had been a NVA and a VC headquarters set up in Cambodia, and that they were no longer only using the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, but they were also smuggling in weapons and supplies and soldiers through Cambodia. And so Nixon, while he's going on TV telling the American people, like, I'm stopping this war, we're scaling back what was called Vietnamization. We're going to be slowly but surely like bringing our troops home. In reality, what he was doing was authorizing a secret bombing of Cambodia. He was actually expanding the war into a whole other country. And that he didn't have to tell the American people of this, right? He was able to keep all of this a secret because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. He didn't have to get congressional approval. He has the right and the ability to do whatever he wants that he feels is, preventing further aggression and American interests. So he does this, and like I said, at the same time, he's telling people that he's going out and ending the war and scaling it back. He finally did announce in 1970 that he went on TV on April 30th of 1970 and announced that we had been bombing Cambodia this entire time. And people responded very angrily. People were really upset. They felt lied to. They thought we were getting out of the war. In reality, we were getting further into the war. And the fighting in Cambodia was some of the most difficult fighting that we're going to see throughout the entire war. So, and this really caused people to question, like, are we crazy? Why did we ever give the president, one person, the ability to control the entire military and not need congressional approval to expand a military action in this way? Like, that was clearly a bad call. So over the next several months, Congress works out a way to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which they will do in November of 1970. And all of this anti-war sentiment really begins to take its toll on Nixon, and he's, realizing, I've got to get reelected one way or another. It's probably not going to happen if I can't finally end this war. So in that maybe fall, Nixon does begin removing the process. He starts with a slow removal of 25,000 troops, and then will continue to increase over that. And by 1972, Nixon orders one last bombing of the North Vietnamese capital and harbors, and then we officially sign a ceasefire the next year. So the United States is out of the war in Vietnam in 1973, but that doesn't mean the war is over for the Vietnamese, right? This was really a war between them. They continue fighting for another 2 years, but ultimately South Vietnam lost the war and surrendered to the Communist North in 1975. So this is definitely something that Nixon has to do some damage control for. And like I said, that anti-war sentiment has really grown, and we're going to see the center of this anti-war movement being happening around college campuses. College students from across the country are going to line up in protest constantly, and this wasn't just something that was happening when Nixon was president. This was happening too when Johnson was president. They would chant things like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And stuff like that. They had been holding protests all through the 60s to support the civil rights movement and women's liberation and the environmental movement. College enrollment is higher than it has ever been. There are over 9 million students enrolled in college in the United States by this time. So it makes sense that this would be a hot spot it's already a hot spot for social change. It makes sense that this would be a place where the anti-war movement would get its first footing. And there was a lot of reasons why these people were against the war. They didn't feel like the war involved the United States. This had nothing to do with us. A lot of people felt like it was morally wrong because there had been so many war crimes reported. A lot of people felt like this money could have been used better. I mean, think about it. We're spending $150 billion on this war. What if we had spent $150 billion on urban renewal projects or on education or on science and technology or any of these other things? But one of the main reasons why a lot of these protests become so huge is because it was definitely a social event. I mean, it was like, college campus, everyone's going down to the protest, to the rally. If you don't go, you're going to be left out. So, it was a place where people would meet each other and hang out. So it was certainly, like I said, a social event just as much as it was a political event. As far as the older generations and the more conservative side, people who either supported the war or maybe didn't support the war, but definitely didn't support protesting, they felt that this was a result of this post-World War II affluence and privilege that a lot of these students have grown up in, and they felt like, they don't understand what it's like to really work. They don't realize how lucky they really are. And the perfect example of this was when President Nixon, he called protesters bums, and he said that these are bums. They don't take this seriously. They don't understand how lucky they are. The true heroes are the men who are fighting for us in Vietnam and all of this other stuff. So he's really trying to, and a lot of the media did this. They depicted these anti-war protesters as traitors and people who were anti-American, and then you have the other end of the spectrum where it's people who are, the guys who are being drafted and enlisting, those are the real Americans. Though definitely the most famous and largest protest group to lead this anti-war movement was a group called the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. They were founded in 1960 at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and they were originally a different group, and then they just sort of rebranded themselves as SDS and became a new group that's main focus was being anti-war and anti-draft. Those are really the things that they were known for. And they ended up having chapters of SDS at basically every major college and university. And even though Ann Arbor was the first, probably the biggest and most well-known college to have protests was the University of California at Berkeley. These students started holding sit-ins and demonstrations protesting the war. Huge protests. They burned their draft cards and all sorts of stuff like this. They would hold sometimes disruptive protests and things like that. But certainly the most famous protest to happen in the United States that was anti-war was the Kent State protest. So this was the day after, this whole situation started the day after Nixon went on TV and announced that he had been bombing Cambodia. I remember he did that on April 30th. Well, on May the 1st, 500 students at Kent State, which is in Ohio, assembled at the center of campus in this like grassy area and protested for a while. And then they, headed to class at 1:00. It was time for class, and so a lot of people had to go. So they were like, we're going to come back out on May the 4th on Monday, because this was a Friday. So they're like, on Monday, we're coming back out and we're protesting again. So everybody make sure that you're back here on Monday. During that protest that they had that first day, it got pretty normal. Like they burned, it was kind of rowdy, but nothing crazy, like plenty of chanting and singing, and they dug a hole in the ground and buried a copy of the Constitution because they said that Nixon had killed it, and all this, dramatic stuff. Well, that night in town, a fight broke out between some Kent State students and some people who were like from the actual town, people who like grew up there. Beer bottles got thrown, windows got broken. Eventually, police arrived. By the time they do, there are 120 people have gathered in the street around a small fire, and this, kind of mini riot is happening. So the mayor ended up declaring a state of emergency, and the police used tear gas to get the students back to campus. So all of that happened on Friday. The next day, Saturday comes, the mayor asks for the governor to send the Ohio Army National Guard to come, and he agrees. They finally arrive around 10 p.m. When the National Guard gets there, there's a protest already underway, and the protesters, someone has set the campus ROTC building on fire in protest against military action. Firemen show up to put out the fire. The protesters start trying to cut the fire hoses and throwing stuff at them. So once again, the National Guard and the police have to use tear gas to get the students back. Sunday comes, the governor of Ohio, Governor Rhodes, goes on record, calls the protesters un-American, says some not nice things, which just riles people up more. Another rally, more tear gas. Finally, Monday comes. Now remember, they were already planning on having a protest on Monday, but they weren't anticipating all hell breaking loose over the weekend and everything being absolutely nuts. So of course, the protest that was scheduled for noon on Monday, the university is like, it's canceled. Y'all are not having a protest. Tensions are too high right now. We've had too much crazy stuff happen over the weekend. No one's protesting on Monday. But of course, the students show up anyway. 2,000 students show up anyway for this protest. So the National Guard is on campus, and they start trying to disperse the students, and the students refuse to go, so the National Guard begins to tear gas them. Students start throwing the tear gas canisters back at the National Guardsmen. They would just, run away from where they were and reassemble somewhere else on campus. The National Guardsmen began to advance at the crowd with their bayonets drawn. and sort of move in on them. And somehow in the chaos at 12:24 p.m., Sergeant Myron Pryor was the first person to fire shots into the crowd, and when he began firing, several others did as well. A total of 29 National Guardsmen admitted to firing a total of 67 rounds of ammunition in 13 seconds. And in those 13 seconds, several students were shot, 4 of which were killed. The 4 students, another 9 wounded aside from the 4 killed. Of the 4 students killed, one was named Sandra Schuer, or she was not actually part of the protest. She was 20, shot in the neck, and a guy named William Schroeder, who was 19 and shot in the chest. Neither of them were part of the protest. They were actually just walking to class. The 2 other students killed were part of the protest. Allison Krause was 19. She was shot in the chest. She was part of the protest. And Jeffrey Miller, who is 20 years old, he was also shot in the mouth, and he died. He was part of the protest. This is a photograph of Jeffrey Miller, and this is probably the most famous picture of the Kent State Massacre and everything that happened there. Like I said, there were other students who were injured. One student, Dean Kaler, he was shot in the back and paralyzed, but these were the only 4 to be killed that day. 8 National Guardsmen were indicted, but a judge dismissed the case because they said it was too weak. The argument was that the National Guardsmen said they felt their lives were in danger. And this is an easy scenario to compare to something like modern police brutality, something that a lot of social change groups are focusing on now, or even the Boston Massacre, an unarmed crowd egging on a group of soldiers. Soldiers say that they felt that their lives were in danger, and ultimately they end up firing and killing people. As far as how the American people reacted, 58% of Americans at the time said that the students were responsible for their own deaths, because there was such a narrative of these students are so un-American. A lot of people were like, well, that's what they get. They shouldn't have been protesting. They should have just listened. Were the National Guardsmen's lives in danger? Well, the closest National Guardsman to the crowd to fire his weapon was 71 feet away. And the furthest away was 750 feet away. I find it highly unlikely that even if the closest one felt that his life was in danger, that the one who was 750 feet away from the crowd felt that his life was in danger, especially since the crowd was pretty much unarmed. And this just sparked a continuous wave of protests on May the 8th. This happened on May the 4th. On May the 8th, 11 people were stabbed with bayonets by the New Mexico National Guard at the University of New Mexico. On May 15th, 2 students were killed and 12 injured by National Guardsmen at Jackson State College in Mississippi. Over the next several years, 10% of the 2,500 colleges in the United States are going to see violent protests during these war years. And so this is having a significant impact on the psyche of the American people. We're seeing a generation grow up in a time of extreme violence and social change, and it was constant turmoil and chaos. There's obviously eventually going to be a backlash of all of this, and that's going to be one of the reasons why when we get to the 1980s, there's such a resurgence of tradition and conservative culture because of all of this chaos here during these protest and social change years.